Welcome back to the deep dive. If you're grappling with, well, the sheer weight of evolutionary biology, you know how intense those foundational texts can get. So our mission today, we're giving you that shortcut. We're diving deep into a really key chapter from Strickberger's Evolution, the one covering the Darwin-Wallace theory of natural selection. We're pulling out the core stuff, the historical trigger, the actual mechanism, the evidence Darwin leaned on, and, what really set these two thinkers apart.
Okay, so to boil it right down, evolution by natural selection needs four key things to happen. Think of it like an engine. You need changing environments. You need variation that can be inherited, differential reproduction, some individuals leaving more offspring, and, crucially, limited resources.
Oh.
And that last one leads to competition.
Right, competition.
Yeah, without all four, that engine just doesn't run.
It's the engine driving everything. But what's really fascinating is where the spark for that idea, that competition idea, actually came from. Okay, let's unpack this. It definitely wasn't from looking at fossils initially, was it?
No, not at all. And this is, well, kind of wild. The bedrock idea for modern evolutionary theory actually came from political economy. Both Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, working completely separately, got their big insight from reading the Reverend Thomas Malthus back in 1798. He was an economist specializing in demography. Malthus's main point, which is pretty radical then, was about population versus food. He basically said, look, human populations, if you don't check them, they grow geometrically. 2, 4, 8, 16, boom. But resources, food, land, they only increase arithmetically 1, 2, 3, 4, much slower.
So Malthus is saying scarcity isn't just a bad patch, it's the default state. This gap, it creates this constant crushing population pressure. Malthus called it the struggle for existence.
Exactly.
And this struggle must lead to what he called checks, famine, war, disease, horrible stuff. And the key thing you mentioned, Malthus applied this not just to us, but to plants and animals too.
That's the absolute linchpin. See, Malthus wasn't thinking about evolution. His solution for humans was prudential restraint, like marrying later to have fewer kids and avoid all that misery. But Darwin, he read that and saw the massive implication for the natural world.
Oh.
Because plants and animals, as Darwin put it, they have no artificial increase in food and no prudential restraint from marriage. So that Malthusian struggle, it's always on, full force, constantly filtering populations in nature. That struggle became Darwin's keystone for natural selection.
Okay, so Malthus gives them the pressure cooker, that constant struggle. How did Darwin and Wallace then turn that into a mechanism for how species actually change over time?
Right. Once you have that keystone, the rest sort of falls into place like a cycle. You've got too many offspring being produced for the limited resources. That means competition. Now, factor in natural variation. Some individuals just happen to be better suited, better adapted to survive and reproduce in that specific environment. They leave more offspring, passing on those advantageous traits. That's step one, selection.
Okay.
Then, step two is what happens over time. Those selection pressures keep working, generation after generation. Combine that with environmental changes and ongoing hereditary variation, and you get modifications. Existing traits change, or sometimes totally new ones emerge and spread. Eventually, enough change accumulates, and bam, you might have a new species. And even the timing is interesting, too. Darwin reads Malthus in 1838, sketches out his idea by 1842. Wallace reads Malthus sometime before 1848, but the whole theory apparently just flashed upon him. That's the phrase used. During a fever, years later in 1858, internate.
Wow, a fever dream of evolution?
Yeah.
So Wallace suddenly gets this idea, the same one Darwin had been slowly, painstakingly building for 2 decades.
Exactly. Same core mechanism, developed in total isolation.
It's pretty incredible they arrived at the same place. But their theories weren't exactly the same, right? What were the subtle differences?
Yeah, there were some important distinctions, mainly around 3 points. First, artificial selection. Darwin relied on it heavily. He looked at dog breeders, pigeon fanciers, farmers, using it to show that selection works, that it can produce dramatic change.
Okay, like proof of concept.
Right. Wallace, though, he was kind of skeptical. He wasn't convinced that what humans did with breeding shed much light on the natural process. Second difference, geographical isolation. Wallace thought physical separation was much more critical for new species to form than Darwin initially did. He put more emphasis on it.
And the third one, that's the really big one, isn't it? About us, about humans.
Absolutely. This is where they really diverged. Wallace, who later became interested in spiritualism, basically drew a line. He argued that natural selection could explain our physical bodies, sure, but not the human spirit, or our complex minds, things like math ability, artistic talent, musical genius. He felt those higher faculties must have come from somewhere else beyond purely material struggle.
That's fascinating. And before we get to Darwin's evidence pile, we have to touch on that famous phrase, survival of the fittest. It wasn't Darwin's, was.
No, not originally. It was coined by the philosopher Herbert Spencer. Wallace actually liked it and pushed Darwin to adopt it in later editions of Origin of Species. Darwin eventually did, but kind of reluctantly. He later apparently mused that something like struggle for reproduction might have been better, less misleading than struggle for existence.
Right, because it's not just about surviving, but passing on traits.
Precisely. It just shows they weren't only battling with the science, but also with finding the right words to explain this revolutionary idea.
So Malthus gives the pressure the mechanism filters based on variation, but Darwin knew he needed solid proof that this filtering could actually create something new, substantial enough change to make a new species. And he found that proof where? In barnyards and gardens?
Essentially, yes. His use of artificial selection was absolutely critical for demonstrating the sheer power of selection. He pointed out how quickly human breeders could create massive extremes. Think about dogs, Canis lupus familiaris. You go from a huge St. Bernard to a tiny Chihuahua, all through selective breeding within one species.
Yeah, the range is incredible.
He obsessed over pigeons, documenting how a breeder, in just a few generations, could create birds with traits so exaggerated, like beaks so short they couldn't feed their young, or feathers so elaborate they couldn't fly properly.
So he wasn't just noting variety, he was amazed by the speed and the degree of change.
Exactly. For Darwin, this was Exhibit A. If humans, just by picking traits they liked, could achieve this much, this fast, well, imagine what nature, with its unrelenting vigilance, could do over vast stretches of time. It proved selection could generate forms distinct enough to be called new species if found wild.
Which brings us neatly to the time element, that vastness of time.
Absolutely crucial. If artificial selection showed it was possible, geological time showed when it could happen. Darwin realized that for natural selection to sculpt the diversity of life, it needed immense amounts of time, millions and millions of years. He understood this deep time was essential. In the first edition of Origin, he even tried to calculate it himself. Based on how fast he thought the wheeled area in England was eroding, he estimated Earth's workable age for life at around 300 million years.
Which was actually a pretty good guess for back then, wasn't it? Better than some physicists.
It really was, especially compared to the influential physicist Lord Kelvin, who argued for a much younger Earth, maybe only 100 million years old. Darwin got a lot of criticism for his calculation, so much so that he actually removed it from later editions of the book.
Ouch.
Yeah, but the core idea remained vital.
Hmm.
Evolution needs deep, deep time.
Okay, so you have selection working over this vast timescale. But how does one species actually become two or three or more? How does the tree of life branch out? That's where the principle of divergence comes in, right?
Precisely. This was Darwin's mechanism for speciation, for explaining the branching pattern. He argued that competition is most intense between individuals or groups that are most similar, those using the same resources, living in the same way.
So competition is toughest within a species, or between very closely related ones.
Right. Therefore, this intense competition tends to drive subpopulations to specialize, to diverge from each other. They move into slightly different niches, maybe eating slightly different food or living in slightly different habitats, just to reduce that head-to-head competition.
Right.
Over long periods, this divergence, this specialization, leads to them becoming distinct species.
And that's what the famous diagram in Origin shows, the only one he included.
That's the one, that branching tree diagram. It's not a ladder, it's a tree. Visually representing this idea of lineages diverging, splitting off, specializing over time. It's a dynamic picture of life, constantly exploring new possibilities.
And when Darwin was thinking about the raw material for this divergence, he focused mostly on small, continuous variations, didn't he? He wasn't big on sudden jumps.
No, he really stuck to the idea of gradualism. He famously adopted the saying, natura non facit saltum. Nature makes no leaps. He believed speciation happened through the slow accumulation of tiny, incremental changes.
How does that hold up today?
Well, it's largely held up, but with more complexity, of course. Darwin didn't know about genes, about Mendel. We now understand that many traits are influenced by polygenes, lots of genes, each with a small additive effect which fits nicely with gradual change. We also know about epigenetics, adding another layer. But perhaps the biggest conceptual shift is that we now see variation primarily as a property of populations, of the whole gene pool, rather than focusing just on individual differences, which was more Darwin's perspective.
Okay, this brings us to the big question, the drama. Darwin sits on this earth-shattering idea for, what, 21 years? He writes an abstract in 1842, but doesn't publish Origin until 1859. Why the huge delay?
It seems there's two main things were going on, and they were probably linked. First, genuine fear. Fear of the social and religious uproar he knew his theory would cause. There was this anonymous book in 1844, Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, that proposed a kind of evolutionary idea, and it got absolutely slammed, ridiculed by the scientific establishment and the church.
Right, so Darwin saw that and thought, uh-oh.
Exactly. He was part of the establishment, a respected gentleman scientist. He likely feared destroying his reputation. The second reason was his scientific caution. He wanted to build an absolutely overwhelming case. He needed mountains of evidence, not just for natural selection itself, but especially to develop and support that crucial principle of divergence, his explanation for speciation. He wasn't just going to toss the idea out there half-baked.
That caution, though, almost cost him everything, leading to that incredible 1858 moment. Tell us about that.
Right, the climax. So Wallace, out in the Malay archipelago, independently figures out natural selection, writes up a paper, and sends it to Darwin, of all people, asking Darwin to forward it to the geologist Charles Lyell if he thought it was any good.
Darwin must have panicked, seeing his life's work about to be swept.
Utter panic, by all accounts. He felt his priority was about to evaporate. So he consults his influential friends, Lyell and the botanist Joseph Hooker. They come up with a plan, a rather expedient one.
Okay.
They arrange for a joint presentation at the Linnaean Society in London. It includes some excerpts from Darwin's unpublished 1844 essay and a letter he'd written, alongside Wallace's complete paper.
So they presented both.
Yes, but here's the kicker. Neither Darwin nor Wallace was actually there. And Wallace had absolutely no idea this was happening. He didn't know his paper was being presented alongside Darwin's unpublished work to basically secure Darwin's priority.
Wow, that's complicated. And what was the reaction to this joint paper, this huge reveal?
Almost nothing. That's the great historical irony. This monumental theory is unveiled, and the scientific community mostly just shrugged. There was very little discussion, no immediate revolution.
Seriously, why?
It seems the idea itself, the mechanism presented relatively briefly, without the massive weight of evidence Darwin had accumulated, just didn't land with force. The real impact, the revolution, only kicked off a year later when Darwin finally published his big book on the origin of species, packed with all that evidence he'd gathered over 20 years.
So the evidence was arguably as important as the idea itself for making people listen.
It really seems that way. The mechanism needed the proof to be convincing.
Okay, so let's wrap this up. What are the absolute must-know takeaways from this deep dive into the origins of the theory?
Well, the Darwin-Wallace theory gave us a mechanism for evolution, driven by that relentless Malthusian pressure, too many mouths, not enough food. Darwin showed its power using artificial selection as a model, and explained how life diversifies through the principle of divergence, all unfolding over vast geological time.
And the core concept for anyone studying biology.
It's understanding that variation isn't just noise or imperfection, it's the essential raw material. And that selection pressures are always acting, constantly modifying life. It's a dynamic, ongoing process.
So here's a final thought for you to chew on, building on what we just discussed. If that groundbreaking 1858 joint paper presenting the core idea was largely ignored, does that maybe suggest that in science the sheer weight of evidence, the proof, might actually be more critical for sparking a revolution than even the brilliance of the initial concept itself? Something to think about.